May the words and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Amen. It is hard to be a woman in a man's world. Before the Barbie movie brought that message home to us, the book of Ruth did. The book of Ruth is one of two books of the Bible named after a woman. The other is Esther. There are 37 books of the Bible named after men. Ruth is just 4 chapters long, and it's the story of a friendship, a family relationship formed between Ruth and Naomi, the loyalty they have to one another, and their resourcefulness in a patriarchal society. And because of their resourcefulness, King David comes to be. The baby who is born at the end of this first reading, Obed, is the grandfather of David. And even though the book is named after Ruth, the way it concludes the next verses after the ones we ended with today is a lineage of David that cuts out all the women. So Salmon begets Boaz, Boaz begets Obed, Obed begets Jesse, Jesse begets David. It is hard to be a woman in a man's world, even when a book of the Bible is named after you. And speaking of that name, I mentioned that this is about a relationship between 2 women, Ruth and Naomi. Why name it after Ruth? We know why they didn't name it after 2. No one gets 2 named book Bibles. But why they choose Ruth? Because Naomi is clearly the central character of this story. She gets 19 lines of dialogue to Ruth's 12. She's the one who talks about God. She is the orchestrator of all the action that happens in the story. Ruth follows along, but it's at Naomi's pushing. And the way the story ends, what we read today, talks about the women of the village, the women of their town, declare that a son has been born to Naomi. The mother of the child who is born is Ruth. This story is a story about Naomi. So why did Ruth get the name credit? Because it's hard to be a complex person in a complex world. And Naomi, is a complex character. Naomi is a complex character. She has unresolved issues with God. Ruth is not a complex character. Ruth is pretty simple. She follows what Naomi tells her to do. She's loyal to that relationship. She really doesn't have much relationship with God at all because Ruth is actually a foreigner to the Jewish religion. So she's just following along with what Naomi does. Naomi, well, let me tell you a little bit more about her story and what makes her so unresolved with God. We meet Naomi at the beginning of the book of Ruth. Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons are leaving Bethlehem because there's a famine in Bethlehem, and they go to Moab. Moab is a foreign land. They set up shop there. Her husband dies, but she stays there. And her 2 sons marry 2 good Moabite women, and then they both die. The sons do. Leaving all 3 women without any children, without any husbands, without any men at all in their family. And in a patriarchal society that left them incredibly vulnerable, economically, socially, really by every measure. So Naomi is pragmatic. She thinks I need to go back to where I came from, where I have family. So I'm going to go back. And to her 2 daughters-in-law, she says, you guys should stay with your family. Maybe marry again, at least have their support. And one daughter-in-law says, yes, I'm leaving, a loving goodbye to Naomi. And the other, Ruth, pledges her eternal companionship to Naomi. Naomi, through all of this, is angry. She is angry with God because her husband has died, her 2 sons have died. She feels like she has nothing. And we are used to characters being angry with God in the Bible. And typically, they direct that anger towards God. Naomi isn't even on speaking terms with God. She's just talking bad about God in front of God. So she returns to her homeland with Ruth by her side, and she sees her family, and she says to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Mara means bitter. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" She has returned to her homeland and feels she has nothing. And it's God's fault. She's not looking for the 3 things to be grateful for today. She's not grateful for Ruth by her side, or at least doesn't say that. She is angry and bitter. And focusing on Naomi in this story makes us have to sit with that anger and bitterness and not condemn it. Because the book doesn't condemn it. Her friends and family don't condemn her feelings, say, "You shouldn't say that." But they also don't start calling her Mara. Ruth and Naomi settle. Ruth starts going out to the fields to collect extra food that's been left there and encounters there a landowner named Boaz who treats her kindly. And when she tells this story to Naomi, of this man named Boaz who treats her kindly, Naomi is thrilled because Boaz happens to be a relative and thus could be a potential match. Okay? So she waits to see if Boaz and Ruth are going to, make this thing happen. They do not. And so we pick up with where our first reading is today. And Naomi is like, "Okay, if this is going to happen, I'm going to have to make this happen. Ruth, here's what you're going to do. You need to go wash yourself. You need to make yourself smell good. You need to dress nicely. And you need to go land this man. Okay? You're going to sneak into his house. You're going to wait till he's eaten, till he's drunk, and he lays down. And then you're going to go lay down next to him and uncover his feet, which are not feet. And Boaz is going to show you what to do." That is what Naomi says, friends. I have read this now several times, and I'm still unclear whether anything happened at that moment, because what the story then skips to is when Boaz comes to his senses and is a perfect gentleman and sees in front of him Ruth and Naomi, who are vulnerable women in this society. And he seeks out a way to care for them. And he has some little cultural loopholes he has to get through. But he does that. And all the while, as he talks about God, professes the standard acceptable Hebrew theology. The Lord will provide here. The Lord will bring us blessing. The Lord will protect and care for us. Boaz and Ruth get together. They bear a son, Obed. And that we leave Obed cuddling in the arms of his grandmother, Naomi. But even a newborn baby does not bring Naomi to her knees. We are used to our characters in the Bible doubting God, getting angry with God, getting frustrated, and then a good thing happens for them, and they turn to God and say, "Thank you, you've seen me through all of this. I didn't know you were working, but you were working all this time. You are my God." Naomi says none of that. She doesn't say anything at all. We leave Naomi, to our knowledge, still bitter, still upset, still feeling like she was screwed in all of this, even as she carries this child. When we center Naomi's story, we have to reconcile that sometimes it's okay to be both bitter and faithful. Sometimes our mixed feelings towards God aren't going to be reconciled. I think whoever named Ruth Ruth was really uncomfortable with that. So they chose Ruth, not Naomi. They were uncomfortable with having mixed feelings that were unreconciled towards God, but God isn't uncomfortable with that. Naomi's story shows us that God keeps working. That you can be bitter and act in love. You can be hopeless and act pragmatically. You can be faithful and angry. God is an unseen force in this story. He's woven throughout by name, but God doesn't do anything. But God's plan happens because the characters choose to do good for the person they care about in front of them. Ruth chooses to not leave Naomi alone. Naomi chooses to orchestrate things so Ruth has stability in her future. And Boaz chooses to care for Naomi and Ruth. It is tough to be a complex person in a complex world. However you are feeling about God's unseen presence in our complex world, do the next good thing for the person you care about. It is in doing these next good things that God's plan gets worked out, even against a backdrop of disempowered women, even against a backdrop of grief. God's plan gets worked out as we do good, whatever feelings we're carrying. God's story weaves together the grief. God's story weaves together feelings of abandonment and anger. God's story weaves together pragmatism and loyalty and hope. Following in the steps of Naomi, be honest about where you are, act in love, be pragmatic, and choose a few good companions. God is writing the next chapter, and God needs you to do it. Amen.